Hey everyone, this is Andy Polk.
And this is Ben Shaw.
And this is Bathwater and the Baby Jesus. Today we're going to be talking about violence, our understanding of it in Scripture and the world, and what we do with it in light of Jesus.
All right, here we are. In real time, it's been 2 weeks for you. In real time for Andy and I, it's been about 4 months since we recorded the first batch of episodes. So we are back. We're glad to be back, but we did want to recognize that our release schedule has been a bit off schedule for the last couple of weeks.
Right.
And there's been some illness involved with that on my part. Andy is as healthy as an ox.
Let's go with that. Sure.
And also just proximity in the country to where we are. We live in Tennessee, and there's been quite a bit of turmoil over the last, in the last month that has affected our recording schedule. And So
for both personal and professional reasons through it all. It's been a time. I don't know if you've paid attention to the state of Tennessee, but we're not doing great. This has been somewhat of a running joke / mourning period, I think, for some. And it's been hard, particularly with the Covenant shooting, certainly everything with the Tennessee legislature. But the big one was the Covenant shooting when people, especially children, lose their lives. And I'll admit, this has been a really difficult period for me. Not with, I didn't have any family. I didn't lose anyone. It's not that period, and don't want to make it in that way. But like perhaps many of you, the reactions of a lot of Christians, a lot of institutional church folk has been really, really, really troubling to me in ways that have even further challenged my relationship with the institutional church, my understanding of it. But that's part of what we're doing at Bathwater and the Baby Jesus, right? I'm not giving up Jesus, but it seems there are more turds in the bathwater in a lot of ways than I anticipated. So that's today why, in some sense, we're going to talk about Christianity and violence. Not just because it's topical, but because it appears increasingly that this subject is a much needed subject that tends to go away from our understanding of the gospel and Jesus' message.
Yeah. Right. We debated releasing a short episode or a short statement right after, because we had scheduled to record the day after or the couple of days later after the Covenant shooting happened. And I had all these great ideas about putting together a prayer or something. And then I sat down to write it, and I was just like, I can't do it either. And Andy was like, I definitely can't.
Yeah.
And so we do want to acknowledge that it's been hard. And for me, it hit in a different way, which is terrible just when you think about the fact that it's easier to compartmentalize like a shooting that happens at a bank or even at a high school. But my children are the age of the children that were involved in that shooting. Like I have a child, the exact age of all three of the children that were killed. And so it hits a different way, and to see the response from some, and I will say some, because there's certainly some clergy that stepped up and were very vocal about the need for change in the way that we regulate firearms. We're going to try not to get political in all of this, but I think our stance is probably going to shine through in some of our statements. So we do want to acknowledge that, and we certainly. And I'll be the first to admit, I mean, I grew up hunting. I grew up around guns, and I certainly don't have any issues with people owning guns. But I do think that there are some serious problems with the type of weapons that are available to be purchased and the way that people go about getting them.
Yeah.
And I'll just say that, and we'll move on as far as anything I have to say about that. But I do think that looking at violence in Christianity, in the history of Christianity, going all the way back to the Old Testament, even, will kind of, I guess, support those
Yeah.
ideas a little bit, in just the way that we look at it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I mean, this is a difficult thing that we'll talk about. We'll not skirt around, right? It touches a bunch of subjects, and probably in some sense, maybe even for the next few weeks. This idea that, well, religion, well, that's not religion, that's politics, is completely made up. One, there's second order categories that have very little understanding and are pre-modern times. But also, if we're people of faith and our ethic and our worldview is described by Jesus, then the idea that doesn't touch on politics is absurd. I mean, if there is heresy, that comes closer to the most of the doctrinal issues that I think a whole lot of people have. So we're not worried about necessarily who you're going to vote for and how that stuff moves, but there are things that are going to touch politics, and we will explain why we believe that way based on our ethics, our understanding of the gospel, and people could disagree. But this is one of the things, right? So people know I'm a professional historian, or I teach U.S. religion and politics. And one of the things I tell my students, especially in my survey courses, right? Those students, by the way, who of course are taking U.S. history because the state of Tennessee forces them, and they would never be in there otherwise. Right. I don't know if you ever had that experience. That's hard.
I did. Tell them I attended the university that
yes,
you teach at,
it's beautiful times.
But I took Tennessee history.
Oh yeah, that's okay. You just want to know more about the great state.
I was just avoiding you.
One of the I wasn't there then, was I? Was I when you're finishing up? I might have. Yeah, that's fine.
I don't know. It was 2014.
But this is one of the issues of talking about politics in general, even about religion, right? That you have your opinion, and you have your opinion, I have my opinion. We are each entitled to our own opinions, but I do think that as adults we should be able to explain why we believe what we believe, and we should be able to understand how other people could believe something else. Sure. I think that is a low bar. I think it's a minimum. But because that's the bar, that's what we will try to do.
Well, and let's just call a spade a spade. Right now in our political landscape, it's us and them. There is no middle ground. There's no debate. There's no recognizing other people's viewpoint and attempting to apply your understanding to that. It doesn't exist. It's
that's right.
Especially at the top level of politics. And I mean, you see it filtered down all the way to local county commissions. So it's,
yeah, that's right.
It's just the way things have become, which is unfortunate. And there's always been some level of division in politics, and I'm not pretending that doesn't or didn't exist. However, to the extreme that it is now, it's a little alarming to me, the fact that we can't step back and have a healthy discussion, a healthy debate, and then walk away knowing that you can still love and respect the person that you just had that debate with.
That's right.
There's almost a fear in bringing things up, because you're either going to piss a bunch of people off, and they're just not going to listen anymore, and it could even ruin your relationships with your friends or your family.
Yep.
So that's unfortunate, but we do want to name that and point out that that's not where we're coming from.
Yeah. So talking about Christianity and violence, there's a few different aspects of this, and I would say, not surprising, it comes down to Jesus. I mean, it's almost if it's in the name of our faith. But I do think this is a situation that it is sometimes difficult because often we're not actually talking about Jesus when we talk about these things. Part of that is pointing to the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, of what we see in those stories of the understanding of God and violence, of the people of God and violence. But also, quite frankly, the way that the history of the Christian tradition has played out. And it sure doesn't seem that the relationship between Christianity and violence doesn't seem to be parallel to the relationship or the way that Jesus talked about violence. And that's not clear cut
Right.
in terms of how we live that out in a messy and broken world. But we talk about it as with many things in ways that don't seem messy and complicated. They just are, and seem to fly in the face of that. So which one of those do you want to talk about first?
I think it's good to kind of lay a groundwork on the history of violence going all the way back. Not the movie History of Violence starring Viggo Mortensen, which is a very good movie. It's pretty violent, so but it's kind of in the name, it's implied.
Yeah.
But it's a good movie. No, sorry, that's that shiny object over there that just drives my wife crazy. So no, laying a groundwork on the history of violence in Christianity, I think is probably a good starting point.
Yeah.
And what better place to start than the Old Testament?
Oh man, so easy.
It's it is it?
No, yeah. This is it touches a lot of different, I think, issues that people have had. If you read the Hebrew scriptures, they are incredibly violent.
Sure.
Incredibly violent. Certainly in terms of like the conquest of Canaan, dash the babies' heads against the rocks.
And it's not just like go and destroy this tribe. It's explicit on
annihilate. Yes,
the way that
and
leave nothing.
That's right.
Leave nothing breathing left,
including cases when Israel, one particular where Israel gets in trouble because they spared people, as in and really they spared the animals. They took the animals.
Yeah.
God said slaughter everything, including the animals. They took the animals. They let some people live. They took them as slaves, and God said, "You didn't do what I did, what I told you to do," and they're upset. They're incredibly, incredibly difficult passages and understandings of the God that we see is related to Jesus, and then what is presented in the past.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile those things? How do you deal with them?
Well, I deal with them in the same way that I deal with most issues that I have with the Bible, and that is that it was written by people in a place to a certain group of people in that place, and I think that for instance, looking at the stories of like the Canaanite conquest and all of that, and then even going further back, like Sodom and Gomorrah, and dealing with even further back Noah, right? I mean, and it's the rainbow story that we always think about, and we kind of gloss over the fact that that story tells that God annihilated everything except for the two of each and the birds in the air because they could fly.
It really is weird that that's a felt board story. Like it is even when I was
one of the most
little,
violent stories.
It was like, wow, we're just doing a coloring book over the annihilation of humanity.
Well,
and
when you're 5, you just think about the animals, and that's now.
That's
and I'll
part of
say
the
this:
issue.
growing up evangelical and growing up that idea of that, I don't want to call it sleight of hand because it wasn't. I don't think.
No, I think it's intentional for a lot of adults when they were doing it. They didn't think about it either because they were taught in the exact same way.
Correct.
Yep.
And so I don't want to use the word sleight of hand because that implies some trickery was involved. I think it was just bad theology in my opinion, and bad eschatology, right? It wasn't taught well to begin with. It wasn't interpreted well to begin with. And so then that just trickles down through the ages. So anyway, the violence in the Bible, especially that time, Noah, and then you start getting into like Joshua, and that Joshua is written as this big epic story of conquests. You think about like the Battle of Jericho, and did you have the song? Like I Joshua bought
Oh, absolutely.
Again, that's walk around the wall 7 times, blow the trumpets. That's what we're taught, and we don't talk about the fact that they destroyed an entire city. And stepping back and recognizing the humanity of the people that were conquested and annihilated in the name of God, you then have to step back and realize that why did they choose to write down these stories in this way?
Mm-hmm.
Because as we've stated before, on authority and the Bible, you give it the authority when you read it, and you have to. And I don't see the Bible as inerrant, so that therefore I want to step back and ask the question: why did the editors and the writers who compiled these stories
Mm-hmm.
that have been told for ages, whenever they were in Babylon, why did they do that? Why did they tell these stories in this way? And I think, and this is my uneducated opinion. I haven't taken my Old Testament classes yet. Which a side personal update. I don't know if this has been talked about on the podcast, but I am starting seminary in the fall. I'll be going taking some classes and working towards my master's in divinity. So that's fun and exciting. So maybe in 3 years, I'll speak with a little bit more authority.
That's a process too. It can be challenging.
But my uneducated opinion is that they were trying to either justify, and you can speak more to this, and I'm going to throw it to you. But I think that it feels like they were trying to justify the violence that they committed against these other tribes whenever they were nomadic and they were conquering lands by saying that God told them to do it, right? And so when in reality, so did everybody else. They all did the same thing. So they all conquered. Everybody was conquering everybody else. And I heard it said, I read in a book that one of the things that I had never really thought about was why courtesy was so important. Like if strangers were traveling through, you were courteous to them because you didn't want to risk ticking off another tribal leader or another king because you were discourteous to his nephew that was traveling through your town. And then all of a sudden your whole tribe is annihilated. But it feels like there was just one part justification and one part inspiration, trying to tell these epic stories about their heroes, right? Abraham was their hero.
Yeah.
Joshua was their hero. And so why would you tell this story that paints them in a negative light? You would paint them as the heroes of God who are following God's words and doing what they said in God's name, when in reality, it was probably more of a survival thing than anything.
Yeah.
I
mean, I do think there's a lot to that. Although this is the interesting aspect of the Hebrew scriptures in themselves. There is certainly a glorification, an exaltation of these figures, historical and contemporary, depending on which books you're talking about. But there also are multiple instances of these are very clearly pretty flawed figures. Like if the story was simply told just to make them sound good because we were okay and we did and they were great, there's a whole bunch of those stories they should have left out.
Yeah.
The very fact that not just these figures are wrestling with things, that they make mistakes, right? That they doubt and they aren't sure. But also that they explicitly are often, right, times when they're condemned by God, right? They're not doing what they're supposed to do, that they go and come through. So I think the dynamic becomes more interesting, more difficult, and in some sense to me, more believable. The idea that this is written by people in their time and place. And I believe there's some aspect of inspiration, right? I don't deny that these are, there are true aspects of the understanding of God that we can learn through them.
Absolutely.
But we have to do that translation, right? No. I don't think you were implying,
okay.
Right? That, but that becomes the difficult aspect. How is it that you understand these in a way that can make sense? And part of it is, the fact that in the same, these are not isolated stories in the way that we receive them as canon, right? They're collections. We take them together, and there are a whole bunch of aspects, right? If you read the prophets, there are a whole bunch of times where they explicitly say, you murderous bleepity bleeps, you come before God and say that you want righteousness and you want to worship, and you trample the poor and you oppress, right, anyone the stranger who comes in, you murder and you slaughter and so there is a dynamic of this within Scripture that to be clear, doesn't answer the dilemmas of it when you read some of these stories. But the fact that in the same collections, people often those same times and places, or people who come afterwards say the same thing of like, what was this? That's not what God is really doing. That's not who we are. To me, that is, that's comforting in some sense. I'm not the only one who hears this, and it's not me somehow outside. I don't have enough true faith to just accept this. No. This was a struggle for people throughout this history that we have.
Yeah. So let me ask you this then: how do you approach? Let's just say like the books of law, okay?
Yeah.
And there are many instances of quote unquote crimes or offenses that are punishable by death. Some of them, make sense in the tit for tat, thought, like you kill someone, that's
if it's eye for eye,
right?
Which is a limitation of violence, by the way. Eye for eye and tooth for tooth is when he did this. You don't go beyond what was done for you. That was actually a pretty revolutionary limitation of violence in the day. But
okay, say more on that. Sorry.
Oh, well, we'll get to Jesus soon, because Jesus changes a lot of this. But there is, right, when we think of the idea of an eye for an eye or tooth for tooth, we think of that as, well, they did it to you, so you do it to them. That, in some sense, that's true. That's literally what it says.
Right.
But the way that it was interpreted and understood, as far as we can tell, including the midrash of the Jewish traditions who debated this, is that that's a limitation of violence, right? Even in the way that we do things, we tend to escalate, continuous escalation, right? You say this to me, I'm upset. Oh yeah, well you do this, and we go a little more and a little more and a little more. Eye for eye and tooth for tooth is a cap on what people can do in retaliation.
Okay.
If an eye is gouged, you can gouge an eye, but you don't cut off a head. A tooth is knocked out, you can punch them in the face and you knock a tooth out. But what you don't do is take their family and round them outside. Now, the story is very clear.
Yeah.
Israel didn't always do that.
Right.
Same thing as year of Jubilee, same thing as the ethics of strangers and immigrants, of money, of all this stuff. They were very imperfect people. But the tradition continuously says there is some aspect of this.
That makes a lot of sense, but I had not ever really thought to it. It's a colloquial
that's
phrase
right. We
that
say
you say,
it.
and then you well, there you go. Lesson 1 learned for the day. But let me finish the question. It's okay. The idea of crimes punishable by death in the books of law. Okay. So you've got the big ones, right? But then also like a belligerent child can be put to death if they're talking back. And we look at that now and we're like, what? No, absolutely. We'll just skip that one. There was two or three different ones that had to do with children and misbehaving. One of them, if your daughter became a prostitute, you're supposed to burn her at the stake or set her on fire. So how do we transition away from that understanding of God's wrath and his desire for us to regulate his laws and enforce his laws?
Well, I think part of it is, again, admitting, I don't think it's understanding. I do think it's admitting that people in their time and place, writing to people in their time and place, and that...
so you mean the writer that wrote that law might have had a belligerent child?
No. I don't think to that extent. I think the context of the ancient Near East in a tribal society, when in some of the contexts you've mentioned, But I think the way that I understand it, the way that we perceive of it, is we interpret all of that through an understanding of Jesus. Not, I don't mean this in terms of you look back and the prophecy says, and this stuff, we do this symbolism and all this stuff. I mean, in terms of if all of these are expressions of people in their time and place, describing the way they understand God, the way that God moves in the world, the way that we understand us and our relationship to God, the preeminent authority of that is Jesus. And so if sometimes it may be an understanding of the gospel writers. Again, we don't even get unfiltered Jesus. We have to admit that too. We have 4 of them, and they don't necessarily all agree.
Right.
Again, that we have a whole episode on this if you want to listen to that if you haven't already. But there is an aspect of this that if Jesus is preeminent, sometimes Jesus it appears talks over or changes some of those perspectives, but there's a clear understanding through that Jesus at least claims, no, I'm not changing any of this. You have misunderstood the relationship.
Right.
And so, I mean, clearly, I'm not going to kill my kid. I'm not going to beat my kid. They're horrendous, right? I mean, getting this a later one, but the way that women are treated clearly as property, there's very little co-equality in the Hebrew scriptures with this. I think is abominable.
Yeah. And Jesus certainly pivots away from that.
Clearly, I would say, but as we'll even get with this with violence, we have a tendency to pick and choose when and where we listen to those things, when we acknowledge them.
Right.
And I think a lot of it has to do with the way that we want to understand and perceive in the world. I don't think that makes us evil. I think it makes us human. We bring something to scripture. We bring something to faith. And this idea that, well, no, we're just being biblical. That's one of the most annoying terms in religion to me. Just being biblical worldview, biblical. It's not a static thing that just is as if, well, I'm just doing what the Bible says. I can be a jerk sometimes. Those are usually when I get to, let me ask you 2 questions till you get to, I don't know.
Yeah.
What's in the Bible? Where is it? What is it? What about this beforehand? I don't know. Well, then what are you talking about when you say biblical?
Right. I think one of my favorite quotes that I saw somebody, I think it was tweeted out. I don't know. It was talking about when someone responds to you with that, it's in the Bible, it's not up for debate. And, and it's like, but when Jesus was 12, he spent days debating the Bible with the current religious leaders in the temple. So it's in the Bible that Jesus debated the Bible. So therefore, saying that it's not up for debate is just a non-starter. It's not a great way to approach, which again, we've said, I don't want to rail on that, but you have to approach these scriptures and these writings understanding the context in which they were written in and filtering them all through the lens of Jesus and through the ministry that he lived, and then that's a good starting point. And so
but so here this comes right in a transition. I would like to pretend that we planned it this way. We didn't plan any of it. Right, this becomes in the transition. So if we understand the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus, the other problem when we understand Christianity and violence is, well, then Christianity comes after Jesus.
Right.
And if you look at the history of Christianity, a whole bunch of it looks far more like pre-Jesus than Jesus, right?
Yeah, for sure.
The famous and somewhat apocryphal, the phrasing is a little different, but a somewhat famous quote from Gandhi is, the only people in the world who don't see Jesus and his teachings as nonviolent are Christians. Which comes back to, it's just biblical. It's in there, right? Yeah. Jesus, you love your enemies. Is right that not just expanding neighbor, who is my neighbor, but you love them, you bless them, you do good to them. Literally the way that Jesus was tried and murdered and killed, the way that is expressed. Right. People point to, well, yeah, but he turned the tables over when he drove out the money changers. It is one of the most just absurd arguments. Okay. That this becomes state-sponsored violence and my personal violence and me having continuous fantasies about proving my manhood or something by getting in a fight and punching you in the face, and therefore it proves I'm powerful. None of that has anything to do with the thing you're talking about of driving out the moneylenders. It's also the fact that our understanding of Christian history is that Christians that were with Jesus and the next generation and the next and the next and the next and the next, all, it seems, universally thought Jesus said were nonviolent.
He also said to share everything. And,
that's right. That's right.
I mean, there are a lot of things that Jesus said to do that kind of became inconvenient. And,
that's right.
And were...
Yeah, we run by the wayside, and we
yeah.
have. And part of that becomes, so I'm going to say this is a legitimate thing. I believe that's true. I believe that the ethic of Jesus is an ethic of nonviolence. It's really hard to do a bunch of loops around that. And I would say it in my conversations with people, it seems, I think this is true maybe in Christianity as a whole, as diverse as it is, but certainly in the traditions we were raised in and kind of American Protestant evangelicalism. It seems that people really want to follow David and maybe parts of Paul more than Jesus. Jesus you listen to because he saved you from your sins, and you get to go to heaven afterwards, right? So in terms of the ethic of how we live in the world, especially when it comes to violence, it's David.
Yeah.
Jesus stuff doesn't play because that's unrealistic.
Well, David was the alpha male.
That's right. You know, and he goes through.
I mean, he did dance naked and sing, but you know, that's
a whole other thing, and we're not going to talk about that. He was imperfect, and that's okay. Yeah, this is, and right, we don't have to get into all of it, but there's a book that came out a few years ago, Kristen Dumais, of Jesus and John Wayne.
Excellent book.
Excellent book. Yeah, right. So Kristen is not going to give us anything if you buy the book, but it really is. It's excellent, and we'll,
especially coming from the background that we come from.
Yes.
In growing up evangelical in the 90s and early 2000s.
Yeah. There's right. So how is it that we get to this culture and understanding and some sense of faith that seems so content on violence and this kind of alpha male? I mean, it's still very patriarchal, right? A real man somehow is defined by violence, right? If you can dominate physically, mentally, emotionally in the boardroom or whatever nonsense, that becomes the sign of manhood. Her argument, and to be blunt, it comes from an understanding of how on earth that especially white evangelicals in America supported Donald Trump more than any president in history, when everything that Donald Trump says and does seems to run counter to the values that evangelical Protestants have generally said, this is what we believe, and this is what character is, and this is how it is.
Yep.
Her response was, well, it goes against the values that are stated. But if you actually look at the development in the history, the core values, he is the personification of it.
Right.
He's John Wayne.
Yeah, John Wayne was.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's what we want, a rugged individualist who doesn't care and says what he wants and does what he wants. And even though, sexual violence, apparently it's okay because you never know, and you have, right? So all of this comes together. That aspect, I will say just explicitly, I think is, I'm going to say nonsense. It's not nonsense. It's heretical. I think is absolutely holistically against the understanding of Jesus, an aspect of the gospel, the way that we are supposed to view human beings as co-equal, as loved by God just as much as we are loved, as created in the image of God. We don't. It denies that as much as anything else. So that this patriarchal masculine violence is the answer, and that's all that matters stuff. And we may have an episode on power at some point, but that aspect is against the side.
Yeah.
I think there's another part of it that becomes, we live in a broken, messy world. And it's not incredibly clear always what the right thing to do is. Yeah. If we admit that it's messy and it's unclear, right? If there's a difference of me and my understanding of nonviolence, right, if after we record this, you get really mad at me and you start shoving me, I can do nonviolence. I'm not going to punch you in the face. I'm not going to go, you hit me, I can turn the other cheek. That's different.
Just an aside. If you saw Andy and then you saw myself, you would know that scenario.
You're quick.
Would never happen.
You've got fast hands.
Never. I got long arms. That's about all I got going for me.
There's a difference between me doing that with myself and me doing that with my kids.
Yeah.
And I have no problem with that.
Yeah.
I really don't. Now, it's not that I don't think that is itself possibly problematic. I would absolutely violently defend my children.
Sure. Well, part of that is instinct.
Yeah. But I would say, I mean, you know me well, it's also specific choice that's well thought, right?
Sure.
There's some aspect of that is
well,
just
and let me
is.
back up. When I say instinct, I mean cultural instinct.
Sure.
I mean, you know, a product of the culture that we're raised in, and that is to, which might seem oxymoronic when I say this. It's to protect our children, you know, either our children or even, you know, I found myself as a parent being more aware of any children. And like, if I see a child walking alone by himself in the store, I'm like, where's that kid's parent?
Kid? Yeah. That's right.
Let's make sure he's safe. Yeah. And so the oxymoronic part is that if we care so much about our children and it is culturally ingrained to care for our children, then why is it that some of our how do I say this without coming across crass? How is it that some of our legislature and the decision makers allow their own interests to elevate above that cultural idea, and somehow or another they convince people that that's the right thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, they would argue that those are not contradictory. They sure seem by common sense and thought and logic to be contradictory, I would say. As in, we're protecting our children and we're doing this, but also the sacrosanct aspect, right? That particularly is guns. The sacrosanct aspect of the Second Amendment overrules everything, which itself, again, is incredibly problematic and possibly heretical for Christians, that some aspect and one understanding of an American amendment overcomes my ethical understanding of Jesus. That in itself is, I'd say, possibly heretical, but that's a different conversation.
Well, that's elevating. I mean, that's realistically, I mean, let's just name it for what it is. That's the same as being, you know, in first century Jerusalem and that time frame, Caesar was God. As far as that context, like they were supposed to recognize Caesar as God, and so if they did not, then they were going against that. So we have made a god of this amendment, and that has been elevated above Jesus. That analogy is breaking down really quickly, and I'm recognizing that, but that's okay.
Well, so I think that's a helpful segue though. So I'm trying to delineate between some aspect that I think are just, quite honestly, just antithetical to the ethic of Jesus, as I understand it, right? Which, again, like, well, how do you understand it? Whole episode on that too.
Let's quickly just kind of recap. You tell me what we keep talking about the ethic of Jesus.
Yeah.
What, in 3 sentences or less, which is going to be a challenge for you, what in 3 sentences or less is Jesus' ethic as it relates to violence?
We're all bastards and God loves us anyway.
Well, look at you.
That's not me. It's not me. That's from a guy named Will Campbell. It is that every human being is equal before God. That, I think, that is the heart of the gospel.
And so in that equality, none are deserving of violence.
That is right. So there's the sacred worth of all humanity, right? That because people are loved by God in that way, because God wins in the end, even if they were to kill you, right? I mean, this is the take up your cross and follow me. Like, Jesus made it very clear what happens if you follow Jesus. That I don't hear those preached a whole lot. Yeah. Or if I do, it's somehow, you know, we're in the Bible, we go to the South, and it's really hard to be a Christian, even though 85% of the people are Christians, and everyone I know, and my boss, and everyone's, you know, which is just nonsense. But
we like to
somehow persecution.
Ourselves.
Yeah, Starbucks changes their mug, and we're persecuted. That there is an aspect of this which is, because of that, because you follow Jesus all the way into a cross, the cross is winning. Christ is victor, right? That even if they kill you for this, because of the way the world really works, all you're required is to be faithful, and that's a blessing, right? mean, this is the really hard stuff of Jesus.
Sure.
I mean, really, personally, really hard. I'm not entirely sure how to reconcile all of that in the world in which I live.
Oh yeah. Well, and it's difficult in the context that we live in as in one of the
as Romans,
the wealthiest nation in the world.
In this, I think that context, this is the part that is, if we would admit that it's difficult and that we have to work our way through it, I'd be okay. I'm less okay with, again, a romanticization and maybe deification of violence, of guns, of all of this together. So there was, again, so going back to the early history of Christianity, the early Christians generally agreed that until about 170, really, that every writing we're nonviolent. That's the only way to do it. Like you couldn't be a catechumen, a learning Christian, young Christian, if you were serving in the military, or if you were a Roman official who had that part of your job description was to condemn people to death, to violently punish. You just couldn't do it. They were considered antithetical. Around 170, there's a group in a specific province. There was an invasion. Some Christians there joined. The church fathers that we have, at least that are extant, right, that are available, they said that's wrong. You can't do it. Tertullian. He changed his mind later on, that there's sometimes that it can be, but in defense, right? And then it's limited in all these ways. The real change is, in the fancy term is called the Constantinian shift, which I think is overplayed. But the very, very, I promise, brief history of this is
that's around third century, right?
Fourth century, yeah. The 300s. So when he comes up, this is where under Constantine is the Council of Nicaea, the Edict of Milan in 1313, which makes Christianity tolerated in the Roman Empire for the first time. Christians before then were not universally persecuted. Diocletian did, Nero's maybe a little bit. Usually they were pockets in different places and it came in and out. But Christians were incredibly suspect, partly because they were nonviolent and because they would not swear fealty to the state. So they couldn't be trusted. They weren't
because
good
that would
Romans.
be acknowledging that Caesar is God.
That's exactly well, in some sense, for some, I'm getting into the great background. Part of it was you could be a Roman citizen and pledge allegiance to the Roman state without declaring Caesar as God necessarily. There's a bunch of sort of literature of this, but it was the allegiance part was the problem for early Christianity. We cannot swear allegiance to Rome or the emperor above Jesus. It is a kingdom of God inaugurated on earth that exists right now. Yeah. And that is what we pledge our loyalty to. Again, I think the extent of that conversation may be a later one about
I already
civic nationalism, all of this stuff, right? But part of that was the nonviolence of it. By the time you get into the 3rd century, like 200s, there's more debate over this. Christians aren't sure what it looks like, where it goes, but they, for the most part, didn't have enough power for it to really matter. The Constantinian shift is when Constantine, right, quote unquote, converts to Christianity, right? He had this vision, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, and then he has a toleration for Christianity when he confirms the empire, when he brings it all under his rule in 324, right? He calls the Council of Nicaea mostly because he did not want Christians with all of their differences. Christians had massive differences at the beginning.
What?
It would tear apart the empire. He wanted them just to agree on something, and then he would enforce it because he just needed it all together.
Right.
But now, all of a sudden, in a legitimate way, and some from different traditions bemoan this is the end of real Christianity. Some people say it was great. He gave Christians power that they did not have before. And the question became, what do we do with it? How do we use it well? Even how do we use it faithfully? I'm not saying people just want to do their own thing. Right. How do we remain faithful when we have power, when we're in charge and someone invades? Or we believe that people are better off under the Roman Empire, right? So the quote unquote barbarians on the frontier, if we take them over, you look at their city states and you look at our empire and people are better off in our empire. So if long-term we're going to do better for people by Rome being in charge, we got to fight them to do it. So isn't that better? What do? Do you do a little lesser, right? This became a big battle.
Yeah.
The issue now, which I do think it couples with issues of state violence and civic nationalism and all this stuff, white Christian nationalism, but that's not the debate now. It's not a struggle. And I have a really hard time with this. I mean, there's no struggle. It is not an acceptance of a messy, broken world. It is a glorification of violence, particularly among men, but in a populace as a whole.
And I want to say, yes, there's a glorification of violence. I want to add a question. Do you think that it's a glorification of the tools of violence, which then create a internal justification for the violence that they commit? Or do you think that it is a glorification of violence hard stop?
I think the key, the core aspect is the glorification of violence.
Okay.
Even if you take guns away, we're still going to be talking about violence all the time. A real man, about standing up, about we have a glorification of violence as a whole.
Yeah.
Guns are a different thing, right? Because they are an extension of that, but also when you get into, Second Amendment, but then we have to control and it bleeds in a lot with America as a Christian nation, and we can't have America, then it's going to fall and they're going to persecute us. And goes back to the institutionalism we've talked about. If we believe that a thing itself, an institution, in this case, a nation state, is itself sacred or sacrosanct, then virtually whatever that nation state does to remain existing is a good unto itself.
Right.
If the thing is good, what they do to create,
a built-in justification for whatever atrocities
virtually
you need to
anything.
commit.
That's
to
right.
Protect
and that was bad, but that's not what we do in this time. And this other stuff isn't bad because it needs to happen and have, right? If people talked about it in a grueling way, in a way of, I don't know what's right here. I think this, but I'm not sure. That, I think, is a faithful way that we try to walk in the world.
Right.
When it is, if you don't do that, you're an idiot. It's not. No, it's not grueling. It is, this is what you must be.
Yeah.
And violence is the answer to that.
Yeah. And you don't hear language a lot about, if let's just say retaliatory. Okay,
Yeah, sure.
Go back to the eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The language that you hear is if someone wrongs us as a nation state, that we should go in and wipe them off the mat, right? You go in and teach them a lesson, subjugate them to our whatever it is.
Even we bring them democracy or something. Yeah, we got to give them.
Yeah,
sure.
And you don't hear the language of, well, let's go in and meet those people where they are and help them. And at what point do you decide that this gets super complicated, and I don't know exactly.
It does, and I think that's fine. I think so the thing that I kept thinking when you were saying that is, well, it depends on the we.
Yeah, who the we is.
What we think of ourselves as. And again, this may be something we need to talk about later on. There is, it really seems that most evangelical Protestants, Americans, are American evangelical Protestants.
Right.
That what is sacred and sacrosanct has far more to do with America, American values, Constitution, than anything related to Jesus. I think that is heretical.
Yeah.
And by the way, so Ben knows this. Me throwing around the word heretical is almost tongue-in-cheek. I despise you don't hold this theological view that I don't quite understand, or this doctrine that I've heard of but don't know, and you're a heretic. I think this is all just nonsense. It has nothing to do with the ethic of Jesus in itself anyway. But there are some things when it is absolutely opposed and contradictory.
Yeah. Well, when you elevate something above,
it's a new God.
Yeah, it is. It's a new God.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. This is the Ben Asks Andy Questions episode. So how do you think that we should or can approach our station where we are right now in Tennessee? How do we approach conversations with people and not let the anger and the frustration that we have with the decisions that are being made drive the productive conversation in allowing us to share, or I'll say me, to share my thoughts on this ethic of nonviolence.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Not well.
Because it's a visceral thing. It's I mean, we'll be the first to admit I was angry. I was very angry the day that shooting happened at Covenant. I was angry. I was sad. I was trying to figure out how and why this continues to happen. And I have not found a way to be able to productively have conversations with people who I know believe differently about the right to own guns and how guns are regulated. Yeah. And I know we're kind of shifting into a political question, but it's a question that I have, and I think that it probably other people
I think so. Yeah.
have this question.
I think so. Part of it is so I'm not a huge fan of a quote unquote Christian or church response of we stay out of politics or we don't talk about these things. To me, a lot of that becomes.
Let's remove the institution.
Yeah,
from
yeah.
It. So let's just say
individuals
me, as an individual Christian who believes these things. How do I approach?
I think the core aspect of that is far easier to say than to live out, which to me, honestly that's a pretty good indication of you getting close to Jesus stuff.
Yeah.
If I can kind of understand this, but what the crap does it look like in life? Well, now we're probably on a good thing. The core aspect of it is what I can never do, what I'm not allowed to do is dehumanize you.
Yeah.
I can't make you an idiot. I can't make you a monster. I can't make you what you are. This other person I'm talking to is a person loved by God as much as I am loved by God, exactly as much.
Yeah.
And I try and have to hold on to that core. And at that point, I say, I disagree with you. But it goes back to what I said at the beginning. I think the base level we have to do is, if I say I disagree with you, it is incumbent upon me to be able to explain why and how.
Yeah.
And sometimes, and that's fine, right? People, just honest, right? I'm a terrible Southerner when it comes to this. I'm a pretty direct person. I say it as I see it. I try to say it in kindness. I try to say it in respect.
Right.
But it's often impolite. But when we get into these discussions, it becomes an aspect of the way that is lived out. So if you say you believe this is the gun example. If me saying, well, the covenant school is terrible, you agree that it's terrible. You're angry that it's happening. I'm angry that it's happening, right? We do agree on that. This is a horrible thing that we want to change. My understanding of it is if people did not have access to such deadly firearms, which we do have a limitation on firearms, right? I can't have a fully automatic. I would love to shoot an RPG at a tree and blow it up. I think that'd be a lot of fun. I'm not allowed to because civilians shouldn't have that, and we have. So we do agree on that.
And that reason is exactly why civilians shouldn't have that.
There are limits on lethality because of training, because of the way that it works in the world, in different contexts and circumstances. If the answer is, well, culture has gone downhill or mental health, the only way that I express this that is worked at least on a pause. It is, by the way, never come to a, well, I'm really deep down. If the problem is mental health, then let us right now talk about what you want to do to fund mental health. What laws have you thought about? Because if you hate this, and this is the thing, but it can't be guns, then what is it that you want to do? Let's do that.
Yeah.
But if you tell me it's not guns, it's mental health, and that's a problem, and then you don't want to pass legislation or champion mental health, counseling, and access,
then it's a scapegoat.
Then you are full of crap.
Yeah. You have created a scapegoat
that is right.
that you want to redirect.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, again, when you point out someone's inherent contradictions,
usually doesn't go well.
It does not come to it. But what I try to do, and I don't do it well. I do it better with strangers than I do with people that I know and love and I'm close to.
There are, I don't do it well at all.
Yeah,
I'm not.
it's hard.
And that's why I'm asking, because it is hard. And I think recognizing and understanding that it is hard. However, it's important to know where you stand and be able to as you said, know why and explain why and how.
And it's important to speak up about that if you want to try to make movement. That's okay.
Yeah.
But what we can't do is dehumanize the other person. They're just
correct.
An a-hole. They're just
then you're othering the other.
It's the exact same. It's the exact same thing. I mean, this is the problem. And I'll be honest that I say that and it's somewhat of a, a Christian-y thing. We can't do that. And we love everyone. They go, I have significantly harder problems than good old church folk than I do with most of the people that those good old church folks say, well, it's hard to love these people. I know sex workers works with them. I pretty easy relationships, far easier in terms of, and honestly, often closer moral stances with people outside of the church.
Sure.
Than sometimes people inside of the church. I don't know fully what to do that. But if I believe this, then I am responsible for maintaining that faithfulness and loving you even when I think you are going against the understanding of God.
Okay, real quick, we're running up against the time. One more practical question, and it's the same one that I just asked. But how do you approach your pastor or clergy or church leader who is actively promoting this glorification of violence or actively apologizing and making excuses for that? Because it's a different scenario, right? You're not approaching a stranger or a family member. It's someone who you have allowed to have some type of authority over you as it relates to interpreting and preaching the scriptures in the Bible. And so if you see that, how, what's a good way to do that? Is there a good way?
I would hope, I don't know if there's a good way. I hope that you would approach it in the same way. If I'm going to come talk to you, I want to come talk to you, right? Not talk at you.
Right.
And I want to have a meeting, and I would like to discuss this with the standpoint being, this does not seem to reconcile with the faith that I have or the other things that you have taught, the way we believe in the Bible. I need you to help me understand how those are reconciled. And what you don't accept is, it's in the Bible. I know more about it than you do.
Yeah.
Good. You know more about it than I do. Then I need you to explain to me how these things are reconciled, because they don't seem to fit with an ethic of love in the way that this goes.
Yeah.
And I don't know that you may not get to anything, but it is the pastor's back pocket trump card, right? I'm a pastor. Listen to me. And if someone says, well, it's in the Bible, and you say, well, where in the Bible? And they say, well, it's just in there. Trust me. Say no. Yeah. If you haven't memorized the Bible, you may not know it, but I would like you to look it up, and I would like you to tell me, because I can look it up too. And I would need us to have a conversation about this.
Yeah. Okay.
That's the best I got. Yeah. I don't think that's, I think conversations help, not just me. I would say this. What we cannot do is, if we are upset with churches that say, we have the answers, we know this, we are righteous and good because we have this and we're special people and all this specialness, what we can't do is say, they're wrong. I understand the way this really is. I'm special and they're off. It is the same exact thing. We have to engage human beings. It doesn't mean I don't stand up to people. Sometimes it doesn't mean I don't stand against people, but I can't dehumanize them. They're still people made in the image of God like me. It has to matter all the time.
Well, as always, we do hope that you found this conversation helpful and meaningful for you. We would love to hear from you. If you have comments or feedback, you can email us at babyjesuspodcast@gmail.com. I do want to point out that we do recognize that politics and that type of stuff can be divisive, and we certainly do appreciate feedback. But this is a theology podcast. It's one that we're talking about faith and the perspective through the lens of Jesus. And so if you have feedback specifically for those types of things, we'd love to hear from it. But as it relates to politics, that's not really what we're not looking to get into a debate about that. So again, we do hope to hear from you, and we hope that you will join us again next time on the Bathwater and the Baby Jesus podcast.
Thanks, everyone.